Your child's meltdowns or regression may not be random. Let's uncover the reasons why. Hi, I'm Dr. Roseann, and I make calming dysregulation easy. And today we're talking about what are some of those triggers for your child's behavior. And we're going to be talking about PANS and PANDAS, what starts PANS and PANDAS, and what causes those flares to keep happening. And I'm going to share with you the same information I share with people who work with me one on one or in our dysregulation solution group. If you're interested in getting more support from an expert with 3 decades, hop on over to www.drroseann.com/help. And that's our solution matcher. And it's going to guide you to exactly where you need to be. Let's talk about what is PANS. So PANS stands for Pediatric Acute Onset Neuropsychiatric Syndrome. Stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder Associated with Strep. And in both of these cases, even though PANDAS is exclusive to strep, you have a toxin or an immune or a infectious disease trigger that creates a misdirected immune response. The body starts attacking itself, producing a lot of neuroinflammation, and then you see all these symptoms, right? And so a lot of times people want to know, how does this all start? Why does one person get, COVID or the flu or Epstein-Barr or a tick bite and they're fine? And why does another time that it happens? And there's no easy answer for that because you have genetics, you have diet, you have stress, you have so many factors, right? But what we do know is in both these conditions, they have a lot of neuroinflammation and there is a sudden onset. Now, even though the P stands for pediatric, in PANS, it's actually can be an adult onset as well. So any infection or toxic trigger can cause that. So let's talk about common causes that lead to this onset of this devastating disorder. If you're new to me, please know I'm a PANS mom, but I've been working with people with complex behavioral issues, kids, and their families since the early 90s. And yes, I do work with adults, even though I love working with kids, because when you work with a kid, they don't know they can't get better. And often it changes in such a beautiful way, it changes the whole family ecosystem. Once we learn, you got to regulate the brain, you got to calm the nervous system, and then add in layers of support. So if you haven't seen my 5-pronged approach to PANS and PANDAS video or listen to that episode, please do, because it really walks you through how a multi-pronged approach is essential in not just regulating the nervous system, but reducing inflammation and getting your kid on the other side of this and your family. So number one, top cause is probably infections, right? And I mentioned some of them. So infections could be the big ones, right? So it can be just the dozens and dozens and dozens of tick-borne illness. If you're living I live in Connecticut, outside of New York City, ticks are everywhere. If you just walk out on your lawn, there's going to be a tick crawling on you. It freaks people out. There's so much misinformation about ticks that lead to people getting chronic Lyme disease, PANS, whatever you want to call it, people. It means that it moved from early stage tick-borne illness to late stage. And late stage means it gets inside the organs, and the brain is an organ, but it can get into your thyroid, it can get into your endocrine system, it can get inside the uterus. I mean, there's just so many ways that it can cause and disrupt. And, when you have the neuroinflammation, you then have a very strong likelihood that you're having those neuropsychiatric, neurocognitive symptoms. Part of the problem with ticks is people think, one, it has to be engorged. Two, that it has to be there for more than 24 hours, that not everybody gets an illness from a tick. There's just so many things, also including one of the biggest fallacies is that you have to have a bullseye. Research as little as 12 to 13% have a rash of any kind, The greatest amount of research is somewhere in the 30-some%. So it's just not common to actually have a rash. You're actually lucky when you get a tick-borne illness and you have a fever, because then somebody says, well, let's run these things down. So very, very common tick-borne illness, Epstein-Barr, COVID, herpes 6, which is a regular cold virus, Coxsackies, the flu, you name it. These are all potential triggers. Now, people will say, does it mean it could happen from one time? Sometimes for certain people, because depending on some of these other factors, it could just be a tipping point. Now, just because I didn't mention your affection does not mean it couldn't potentially be that. And here's the other part. Sometimes kids get these things, and because your immune system, there's actually been soft signs in advance, and your immune system's overactive in PANS or PANDAS, PANDAS is strep only, then you may not actually show the typical signs, right? So they actually test positive for COVID, but don't have a cough, don't have a sore throat, don't have a fever, don't have any of that. But inside, they have neuroinflammation. And this is the same for both the onset and for actual flares. So that's a big aha moment for a lot of people. It doesn't mean that the behaviors have to show up immediately. They can show up later. Inflammation can just keep building within the system. And most of the time when people try to put things together, they know there's quite a bit. Infections, probably the top reason why, right? Genetics, variants, all these other things. These are all factors in why this even happens in the first place. It can be a compounding and some of the other factors. Okay, environmental triggers, mold, toxins, allergens, right? I've seen kids actually get PANS after having a very severe allergic reaction. These things can cause that same misdirected immune response. I often see mold as a nail in the coffin when things have already started. And I also see it as something that just causes flares, right? Have I ever seen somebody only have mold have a trigger? Yes. In pretty extreme mold cases. You know, mold is in 50% of homes. Some of us are more sensitive, some of us aren't. And again, multiple factors. Number 3 trigger for the onset is immune system dysregulation. Sometimes immune systems are either overactive or poorly regulated. That can happen for genetics. That can happen from having compounded illnesses. That can happen from stress. That can happen from very poor food quality, or not eating, restrictive eating, and having nutrient deficiencies. You know, I talk about magnesium all the time. You need it for a minimum of 300 chemical processes within the body. It's a required cofactor, but it's between 300 to 600. And these are physical as well as, physical processes that affect the body, as well as things that affect how the brain works. So if you're not getting enough magnesium, you're not getting enough vitamin D, you're not getting enough, vitamin C, there's going to be an impact in the body, and you just can't run an empty, right? Eventually you run out of gas. And so the immune dysregulation can occur. There's a lot of things that can occur. You can, have adrenal burnout. You can have all these other symptoms not having PANS, but it is a factor in PANS. Our next factor is nervous system dysregulation. Chronic stress and trauma can be a catalyst for PANS and PANDAS. When your nervous system is just super activated, right? There's a multitude of reasons why we have that. It could be clinical issues. It could be your child is just more sensitive. You're more sensitive. There's lots of reasons why we move from a nice, relaxed parasympathetic and move into a sympathetic dominant. It can just be a tipping point for the onset of PANS or PANDAS, right? And when you have this constant activation, there's a field of study called psychoimmunology. And psychoimmunology tells us, it's the study of stress on the immune system, and it tells us that your body's resources will go to defend an unknown stressor and basically leave everything running amok. And really, what does that mean for somebody with PANS and PANDAS or any other condition, really autoimmune condition, is that your body's not going to allow itself to heal because its resources are being occupied elsewhere. What's the antidote to that? Is you've got to pull your nervous system, remove it to a parasympathetic state. And there's lots of ways to do it. Make sure to, listen to my podcast episode, my video on 3 quick ways to calm your nervous system, dysregulated child. It's really for yourself too. Physical issues like a head injury, a trauma of some kind, an accident, I find anecdotally to be often a trigger for the onset of PANS and PANDAS. Why is that? Because we all have infections and toxins within our system. They hopefully are part of a balanced system where things are in check. And when you have a head injury, the blood-brain barrier opens up and whatever is in your body can flood in there. It doesn't mean that it always leads to that. But I have seen in these thousands of people I've worked with PANS and PANDAS, I have seen head injury, PANS connection, particularly with tick-borne illness, because tick-borne illness can hide inside the cell for decades. Such a genetically evasive form of bacteria. It's horrible. Those are connections, right? And knowing what starts the PANS PANDAS triggers, right, and leads to flares is the first step in managing your child's symptoms, right? Whether it's OCD, attention issues, mood issues, whatever's going on. This gives us hope because there's a medical treatment, right? Let's talk about triggers for flares, because this is probably what I spend a lot of my time doing. And recently we had like a bunch of our people who were in our one-to-one program have a flare because it was holiday time and they got together and had a little flare, right? So I wound up writing this like amazing, like step-by-step guide for them. Because I always write these personal emails. When you work in our one-to-one program, you have a lot of access to me, and that's why I only work with a small amount of people. Let's talk about these triggers. So number one, recurrent infections, right? So these can be new infections. We always think we treated and then you're not going to get new infections, or it could be those infections that were not properly addressed, right? Because one of the other major triggers is delayed or incomplete treatment. I mean, my gosh, I see people sometimes, they started something and they're like, it was working, so we just stopped. And I'm like, what do you mean you just stopped? Like, you didn't get back to baseline. And they're like, well, we figured it would just, and then boom, and then it flares again. So it's important to continue your process, follow your providers treatment recommendations. How about that? That's an important one. And hopefully you have a great provider, right, who's really guiding you through and you're seeing micro changes. Always look for micro changes. There's no magic wand for people. If you're listening, I have my magic wand. Stress and nervous system overload is a major, major trigger for flares, for behaviors with PANS and PANDAS, without, okay? So when stressors are happening, right, we need to actively counter stressors in our lives. So you need to be proactive. You need to think about that. But stress in itself can destabilize. Sometimes people will come to me and say, oh my gosh, they totally destabilized and they must have an infection. It's like, wait a second. Your doctor said there was no infection, no activation, and you have X, Y, and Z stressor. That is the cause. Okay, so let's regulate the nervous system. Let's address the stressor. Let's develop some coping skills and move on. Physical injury of any kind, head injury, as I already noted, can be a trigger, right? So your kid's back to, doing whatever they're doing and they have a fall. And please know that the majority of falls are not sports related. They actually are accidents. Just because your kid had a fall doesn't mean they're going to have a flare. But I like for you, number one, if you ever have a head injury, you go to a medical professional, you get checked out. I'm a huge fan of neurofeedback for concussions and head injuries. If you believe that your child is repeatedly in a flare cycle because of head injuries, true story, I have somebody right now. I actually have 2 people diagnosed with bipolar. I'm not saying they're not bipolar because there's a family history of it. And one, we've really come to realize that a long ago head injury is probably what is keeping this person stuck. That head injury, even though when it comes to a flare, it's more recent, an earlier one that's unresolved can be something that's causing a flare pattern to happen. If you want to learn more about neurofeedback, you go to drroseann.com/help. That's our solution matcher that's going to walk you through. I also have awesome blogs there. You can listen to the episodes on neurofeedback. I'm a huge fan, but it's important to get a really qualified professional. Dietary and nutritional deficiencies are one of the biggest causes of flares. Now, I want to be respectful. I get that you might have a restrictive eater. It's, an eating disorder is a possibility in PANS and PANDAS and is one of the symptoms that would get you a diagnosis. So it's real hard to do that dance, and parents find innovative ways to get more nutrients, bone broth, smoothies, sneaking it into food. But you need nutrients to fight this. Now, supplements are a part of that and helping to counter that. I know it's expensive. I know it's hard. But in order to get over the flares, these are things that can be helpful. Also, having the wrong foods and creating an allergy profile, right? Our biggest inflammatory foods are wheat, dairy, and sugar. It's a reality. It is what it is. American wheat has glyphosate, which is a pesticide. It's a chemical, it kills you. These are things that can bring on flares. And I have seen it. It is what it is. I'm, as I always say, I walk the walk. I don't just talk the talk. These are things that we do in our household, and it's not easy. Okay, environmental toxins. I already mentioned mold can really be a flare, but also cleaning products. Some kids are sensitive to polyester, plastics, all these different things. These environmental toxins can be a factor. Hormonal changes can be a positive or a negative. It can bring out a flare. I don't want to scare you, because in some of these groups where parents write crazy things, you'll see a lot about hormones and whatnot. Some kids do fine during the hormone changes. We made it through, okay? But I want to be honest, it can be a trigger for flares. But again, it also can be a positive too, because kids are maturing during that time. And so they might be able to put their brakes on more easily. And so these are this is not the entire list, but these are some of the most common reasons I see for triggers. Now, how do you identify triggers and how do you manage them? Number one, you're going to try to track patterns. So tracking patterns is not writing everything down every day. So, your kid has a flare. You really want to sit down and maybe write down, like, okay, what happened the week before? Not even the day of, because that's where people make the mistake. And you really want to start to say, okay, well, the last 3 times his brother had a cold. And you're like, but he didn't seem like he had a cold, but his brother did. Well, we don't really need to question that, because again, now you're understanding an overactive immune system. You might not actually show the symptoms, even though you're affected, and you would test positive for it if it could be testable. It's the inflammation that it creates. The inflammation and even environmental allergy times can be triggers for kids, right? Is a big problem, right? So number 2, you want to focus on regulating that nervous system. Nervous system regulation is a counter to everything, right? So the psychoimmunology, the nervous system is going to allow the cells to do their work, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, the immune system. It's going to balance the gut. The gut health is super, super important. It's just going to help everything work better, and it's going to make your kid be calmer and you be calmer, because you're going to be doing it with them, right? My next tip is really to look at what's the right treatment at the right time in the right order. This is where people mess up, not because, you're an expert into this, but the experts that you're working with are sometimes like, here, do these 20 things all at once. You have to be a little more strategic. And that doesn't mean you're only doing one thing at a time. Sometimes that's a detriment, but you really want to have guidance from a provider who really knows and can walk you through. In the case of a flare, go back and look what helped previously. Don't have to look for something new. It's probably something you did already. And again, you're going to regulate the nervous system. The other thing that is really important is to address environmental triggers, right? So is it food? Is it things like mold or the cleaning products? What is going on in the environment? What are lifestyle components that could be of help, to get through this flare? Do you need to not be in school? Do you need to go back on an anti-inflammatory diet? You should be on one anyway. Like, what is it that is going to support that environment, and be helpful? So I hope that's helpful because a lot of times I just have this conversation over and over and over again with my families, in our group and one-on-one. And it's just comforting to know that something that did work before potentially could work again. And what we want to think about is flares, right? We always think about flares as these giant ups and then these giant downs. Now, when you start getting the right treatment in the right order, we lessen that curve. And so that we get micro flares. And yes, I believe that people can completely lose their PANS PANDAS profile. I've seen it many times. And then there are people like myself who had Epstein-Barr at 17 years old, and I just do something for my Epstein-Barr every day. And I'm a poor detoxifier genetically. I have birthmarks on my liver. I have all kinds of things. I have poor liver detoxification. So I make it part of my lifestyle so that I don't ever have these issues again. And knock on wood, um, they work. We can't just say, "Oh yeah, well, I had that. I'm never going to do anything again." This is a lesson to regulate our nervous system. Really say, "I'm going to prioritize health." I recently read an article about a woman who worked in hospice. And she said the number one thing people said on their deathbed is they wish they had taken better care of their health in their lifetime. Wasn't expecting that, but of course, right? It makes sense. Practical tips: focus on regulating the nervous system. We're going to have a reduction in symptoms. Nervous system regulation can actually start improving symptoms immediately. We want to look at what we're eating. We want to also think about hydration. And we want to make sure we're making our environment as clean, as safe as possible. Air purifiers can be helpful. Whatever to be a problem, think about it and take action on it and do whatever you can to reduce inflammation. And those other things will reduce inflammation, but also detoxification. What works for you is an Epsom salt bath. Simple walking. Anytime you break a sweat after 7 to 8 minutes is when detoxification starts to happen. And so just get out for a nature walk, whatever you can do. You don't have to make it fancy. You don't have to make it expensive. And then be proactive against infections. If you know infections are really a trigger. I do things all the time. I'm not getting paid for this, but since the late 90s, I use Biocidin throat spray. You will find this on every desk I own, in every bag. All my staff use it. And the one time I traveled without it, we got the norovirus. Use resources that work and don't stop using them, right? I hope this was really helpful. There are multiple triggers. There are multiple reasons. It is important. People get very hung up on testing. Testing is about identifying what the reasons are. There is no test for PANS and PANDAS. It is a clinical diagnosis. So, you can talk about Lyme testing or the Cunningham panel. There's lots of complexities. We're going to do another episode on that. But if you ever felt like your child's PANS and PANDAS flares have been out of control, I really hope this episode gave you clarity. This is why I do what I do. And I'm not just, a therapist, psychologist, author, podcaster, but I'm a mom of Wire Differently kids, including a kid with PANS. So if you're looking for more support, head over to our solution matcher to get the right solution for you. And you can go to www.drroseann.com/help.